Hi, and welcome everyone to Their Stories, which is actually the last one of 2021. I'm Vicky, I'm from the staff inclusion team, and today we are so pleased to welcome Professor Tariq Modood, who is the director of the Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. And he's here to tell us his story, including his formative influences that shaped who he became and what he brought to the university in 1997. Before I hand you over to our guest speaker, I just need to go through a couple of housekeeping points with you. So if you could please be sure that you're on mute throughout the talk. This just helps stop any distracting sounds or any background noises that are happening where you are. There will be a Q&A at the end. But if you've got a question for Tariq, you can get our attention in the chat, and then we'll come to you and ask you to unmute then, so you can join in. But in the interim, if you could keep on mute, that would be really helpful. Feel free to have your camera on or off during the session, whichever you prefer, and take breaks as and when you need over the next hour. If you'd like closed captions on, there are 3 dots on the top menu bar of your screen. If you click on that and scroll down the menu, then you'll be able to enable your closed captions there. Okay, just a reminder that this session is being recorded today, and it will be made available to all staff to watch at a later date. So if you know anyone who couldn't make it today, just let them know that this is being recorded and they'll be able to catch up with this episode. There is a trigger warning for today's talk. The content in the next hour will detail racism and contain racist language, so it's just a trigger warning for you there. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you and a warm welcome to Professor Tariq Modood.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to hear this, which will be basically the first 45 years of my life, thinking back to what shaped me as the academic I was when I was appointed as professor at Bristol University at the age of 45. So it won't be anything about my Bristol experience. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, of parents that originally were refugees from India. I came to England in 1961, aged 8, with very few words of English. We settled in London, and I had 3 years in a primary school, which was co-educational, largely white and quite middle class, as it served a mixed class catchment. And our own neighborhood, in fact, was disproportionately Jewish. For example, we lived round the corner from a synagogue, and the rabbi lived about 5 doors away from us. My school career at that point ended with having failed the 11 plus, and I went to a mainly working class co-educational, what was in those days called secondary modern school. It was 90% or more white at the time, but by the time I left 7 years later, it was only 20% white, about 60% black, and about 20% Asian. It was a tough, non-academic school with a very strict head teacher. And in fact, without his strictness, the school would just have fallen apart. There was racist bullying. This was, of course, the 1960s, the time of Paki bashing. But at school, it manifested less in regular violence than in a racial hierarchy. I can only describe it from the side of the boys. To be at the top of the hierarchy, you had to be good at 3 things: fighting, football, and chatting up girls. The white and black boys met these criteria and so had a mutual respect and socialized together. The Asian boys failed at all 3 and so were looked down upon. One multicultural, or if you like, anti-multiculturalist feature of my time at school is worth mentioning. My school had a daily Christian morning assembly, and my dad was a devout Muslim and saw as one of his duties to teach his religion to his children. So what should I do about morning assembly? My dad asked, what did the Jewish children do? There were very few Muslims at the school when I arrived, I should say that. So I said about the Jewish children, they brought a letter from their parents asking them to be exempt from morning assembly. He said, so what do they do instead? I said they were given a room where they chatted, read comics, finished homework, or simply took the opportunity to arrive late. He said, you certainly won't do that. He said, Muslims and Christians more or less believe the same thing, so fully join in all Christian activities, except when they say Jesus is the Son of God, without making any kind of fuss, just quietly say to yourself, no, he's not. And fully join in I did, to such an extent that in the upper school, I became one of the main readers at assembly, reading from the Old and New Testaments. I organized the school choir at Xmas to sing carols in public places, collecting money for charities and so on. The net result was that till well into my adulthood, I knew much more about Christianity than about Islam. Having mentioned my dad and this oddity, let me mention a feature of our lives that made us statistical freaks. My parents divorced within a year of our coming to London, and my mother, who of course was also Pakistani, my mother made it a condition of the divorce that my dad had a custody of myself and my two younger sisters. So my dad was an Asian single male parent in the 1960s. I don't know what kind of statistical freak that makes him, probably about 1 in a million. Maybe I'll pause the narrative here to reflect on some of the things that I think I took away from this childhood and teenager experience, and that influenced me as an adult. So from what I've just been saying, I'd say firstly, there were elements of difference and commonality, and both were important. My dad emphasized that we were Pakistanis and Muslims and must always be proud of that and stick up for that. And yet at the same time, we must fully participate in what British society had to offer. You could say that is the roots of an aspect of my multiculturalism. Secondly, my mixed class upbringing was something I hadn't really fully appreciated till I got to university, which obviously was far less mixed class in the early 1970s, and came to appreciate exactly how class conscious people were relative to the experience I'd had up to that point. Thirdly, later, especially in the 1980s, when I became active in community relations and racial equality, for some people, it was axiomatic that Blacks and Asians had more in common with each other than either had with whites. This was so contrary to my experience, from which I knew that sometimes that was the case, but it was also the case that whites and blacks had a relationship that left Asians marginal. To return to the narrative, the school gradually began to develop an academic side. The classes were graded, and the top grade began to be prepared for and entered for exams. First, what in those days was called CSEs, then O-levels, what are now called GCSEs, and later A-levels. This happened in a kind of staggered way over the years, with some negative and also positive aspects. One negative was that none of the teachers, except the head, were graduates, and none had been trained for academic teaching. And so I was often being taught by people who were as new to the curriculum as me. The choice of subjects was very limited. For example, at the end of my lower sixth, the social sciences teacher left and was not replaced. And so a friend and I, who wanted to continue with our economics A-level, which we were already in the middle of, had twice a week to walk to another, more academic school for classes in our final year. A positive side was the small class sizes for A-levels. My history class had about 5 pupils in the final year, and the English literature class had just 2. So our classes became tutorials. Both at the time, but especially in retrospect, I came to have a great respect for what my teachers were delivering, with very limited training, experience, and resources. My dad and all my uncles and one of my aunts had been to university in Delhi, and it was just expected then that I too would go to university. But my school didn't send people to university. Well, I'm very proud to have been a pioneer. I was not the only person in my year to go to university, but actually I was the very first person from my school to go to university. That again, I think, was part of my cross-class experience. Coming from an Indo-Pakistani family of graduates, but being taught by teachers who were not graduates, and amongst schoolmates who had no expectation or thought of going to university. Some people see this as a story of upward social mobility. Okay, but do bear in mind that ever since the British arrived in India, my family story has been one of downward social mobility, with some recent reversals, possibly. As none of my teachers had been to university, they were not able to advise me on the subject. I chose the University of Durham as my first choice, but I did not get the grades they asked for. I was, however, accepted by a non-residential and very unposh college of the university called St. Cuthbert's Society, which was a pioneer in widening access before that term was invented. I studied philosophy and politics, and as a first year, I took a subsidiary subject just for that first year called Indian civilization. I was amazed by that heritage, my heritage that I knew virtually nothing about. And I resolved to have a gap year to see and learn more about it, and was able to do that after my master's. I'll just mention 2 other things from Durham, because they were both formative and have stayed with me. Firstly, I was active in the anti-apartheid movement for a while, and in the Stop the Powell campaign. That's Enoch Powell, who was invited by some student association, I think the equivalent of the Oxford Debating Society, but at Durham, to come and speak. And some of us were very unhappy about that. And there was a campaign to stop him. In the end, he didn't come. The universities and the police said it was too great a security risk or something. That's one thing that I think has stayed with me. And the other is that I was introduced to the theories of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the German philosopher who died in 1951, and to the work of Michael Oakeshott, the English philosopher who was still alive at the time and was a professor at the LSE, and was to be the external examiner of my MA dissertation in political philosophy. The two, Wittgenstein and Oakeshott, have profoundly influenced me at a philosophical level and my approach as a sociologist. In 1976-77, after my master's, I had my gap year. I went to stay with my family in Pakistan and India and traveled over the subcontinent, very extensively traveled over the subcontinent, mainly traveling in third-class railway carriages in order to force people to speak to me in what I called Urdu and they called Hindi, because otherwise all my relatives spoke such good English, I just couldn't practice my Urdu. I learned about my family history, which in fact was quite illustrious. It seemed we were an important part of the Mughal Empire before the British arrived and created their own empire. I learned about the Pakistan movement. One or two of my uncles had been very active in that. I relearned Urdu, which had been lost, which had been so lost, in fact, that English had shaped my tongue, and that I'm told I now speak Urdu with a bit of an English accent. I learned a lot more about Islam, and I fell in love with the mountains of northern Pakistan. Highly recommend to any of you who haven't been there. It can be a bit dangerous. Last time I went, I had to have an armed police escort, but it's great fun. I was accepted to do a PhD at the philosophy department, University College Swansea. I'd chosen it as it was strong on Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein actually had lived some time in Swansea during his last years. And it had a distinctive interpretation of Wittgenstein, what was sometimes referred to as the Swansea School of Wittgenstein. I got off to a terrible start. It was that Enoch Powell again. He had been invited to a dinner lecture by the local Conservative Association. So I was one of the people outside protesting with a placard. There were not that many of us, perhaps 10 or 20, saying don't go in and so on, that he was a racist. And while I was doing that, my supervisor and my head of department both walked in, of course, chatting with me, bantering with me as they walked into the event. Perhaps as a result of that, perhaps for totally different reasons, my progress was not good. In fact, I lost my way and gradually turned from the philosophy department to the politics department, where the influence of Oakeshott was strong, and so that was very congenial. And in the end, I actually did my thesis on Oakeshott and another English philosopher, R.G. Collingwood, on their respective and contrasting understandings of the nature of philosophy and its relation to other activities, especially politics. It was a subject that my supervisor in the philosophy department was not interested in. I mean, in a way, I can't blame him because I'd come to do work on Wittgenstein and he was certainly interested in that. And so our meetings became less and less frequent till we stopped meeting. In those days, that was possible, not at all like PhD supervision today. You could ask to see your supervisor if you wanted to, but if you didn't, it wasn't such a big deal. Nobody would write to you or say anything about it. In some ways, I was being very successful. I published articles in good journals at a time when it was most unusual for a PhD student to publish. I met and married my wife, Gynthia. I managed to get jobs when I was interviewed. The first one in 1980 was in the Bristol Department of Politics. But unfortunately, they were all one-year temporary posts. But the biggest problem was that I was not thinking and writing in a PhD thesis mode. And I was unmoored from any kind of oversight. Moreover, there was a very important political change taking place. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, and her Education Secretary, Sir Keith Joseph, were contracting the humanities and social sciences across all universities. I remember reading that between 1979 to 1989, a third of all philosophy jobs, for instance, were lost. So with few job opportunities and no PhD, I had to find some other kind of work. Up to a few years earlier, most people appointed to lectureships, in fact, in sociology and politics, didn't have PhDs. And typically, I would be interviewed for jobs by people without PhDs. But by the 1980s, you did have to have a PhD. So I had to find some other work. I managed to get into the tax inspectorate and asked to be posted in Oxford so I can kept in touch with some university activity and contacts. That did not last long, I mean the tax inspectorate. Every year I used to write to Swansea asking them to grant me another year's extension on my PhD thesis submission deadline, even though I wasn't working on my PhD. In 1983, they said that I had reached the 7-year limit and they were granting me my last extension. I knew that would happen and read the letter with a deep sigh. But my wife, Glynthia, jumped into action. She said, "That's it. You must finally do your thesis." "I did not marry a tax inspector," she declared. I duly resigned my inspectorship and picked up my thesis on the 1st of October 1983, knowing that I must submit it by the end of September 1984. On day one, I realized that I had up to then only drafted chapter 1. On reading it, I decided it wasn't very good. I spent the rest of the week coming up with a new plan. I then had 51 weeks to execute it. I had to write a new chapter every 6 weeks in longhand. I couldn't type. And that would leave me 3 weeks for tidying up at the end. Amazing as it sounds, in fact, I can't really believe it, I did it. I was not in, it just poured out of me. I was not in communication with my supervisor. In fact, I didn't have the time to show it to anyone. I suppose I've just had it processed in my head during all those years that it just came out. And so I submitted it by the end of the very, very end of September 1984. And on the strength of that, I got an interview and was appointed to be a lecturer in political theory at Swansea University. Then followed 4 years of unemployment and part-time tutoring back in Oxford. Upon learning that I was to be a father in about 6 months' time, towards the end of this period, I decided that I had to once again give up on my ambitions of an academic career. In Oxford, I was active in the Community Relations Council, and of course, I had been active in the anti-apartheid movement and Stop the Powell campaign as a student. I also had a political theory understanding of equality. So when I saw some equal opportunities officer jobs advertised as they just had begun to be created, I applied. I must confess that at that point, I knew virtually nothing about race equality, legislation, or equal opportunities policy, let alone the sociology of race relations. When I was invited to 2 interviews, I had a week to do a crash course. The first interview was for the job that I was less interested in, but it gave me the opportunity to practice. At the second interview, I realized that the people interviewing me knew less about the subject than I did, after a week's crash course. And so I was offered and accepted the post of Equal Opportunities Officer in the Personnel Department of the London Borough of Hillingdon, where I was for 2 years, and helped write various policies and train staff to implement them. This was followed up by 2 years at the Commission for Racial Equality in London, which was, the headquarters of racial equality work in Britain at the time. I now have a long page on the Rushdie affair because it took place about then, and it was a very formative experience for me. But I've written so much about it elsewhere, so I'm just going to skip this page. If you don't know about it, you can look it up, but if you don't know about it, fine as well. I'll just say, and I'm skipping it in the interest of time, I'll just say that in that, I put my British Asian Muslim experience and knowledge into my writing and came over time to develop a profile in public intellectual engagement, a mode of activity I really value. More generally, this experience put me a few years ahead of the curve, both in terms of sociology and racial equality, as the predominant thinking in them remained within a 1980s black-white relations frame, what I call racial dualism. My colleagues at the CRE, Commission for Racial Equality, were annoyed and said I was mixing up race and religion. I also lost a couple of friends who argued that I was betraying liberal principles and siding with the fundamentalists. It was, of course, gratifying that after some years of disapprobation, many people gradually came to agree with me and recognized that Britain could not be understood in terms of racial dualism, that Islamophobia was a form of cultural racism, and that a multicultural society could not be built on a free speech absolutism. I'm now only a few years away from my arrival at Bristol University in 1977. I was appointed Professor of Sociology, Politics, and Public Policy. I hope it's clear from my political theory academic background why I have politics in my title, and from my years in policy administration and engagement in public controversies, the public policy aspect in my title. But you may well wonder about the first term, sociology. Well, it was not because of any special study of sociology. I had an O-level or GCSE in sociology from school, but I hadn't taken any courses in sociology at university. I had started reading some sociology of race relations when I became an Equal Opportunities Officer in 1987, and was dismayed to see how far away it was from my British Asian Muslim experience. So when I started writing and publishing on ethnicity and multiculturalism, which was very closely related to the Rushdie affair that I've skipped, and I started publishing on these things, paradoxically, by challenging the dominant sociological black-white relations frame, I began to be noticed by sociologists. And this was quite an important factor in my return to intellectual inquiry. I gradually returned from what I might call my exile, not as a political theorist again, but as a policy-relevant sociological critic. The first step was a one-year fellowship at Nuffield College, Oxford. The fellowship was specially for people in public administration, as I was, who had something interesting to say about some policy area. If I had to compete with political theorists or sociologists, my CV at the time would have looked out of date or too shallow. So that was a lucky break for me. I finalized a collection of writings, short essays, book reviews, things like this, which was published under the title of Not Easy Being British, finalized during my fellowship, but most of which was written on the train commute from Oxford to London and back when I was working in London at the Commission for Racial Equality, supplemented by some pieces written at Nuffield College. During the fellowship, I also drew up a new book proposal that put Muslims at the centre of future minority-majority relations in Britain, and which was rejected by more than 15 academic and commercial publishers before it was accepted. Following in the wake of the Rushdie affair, when liberals closed ranks, I think that was the biggest set of discriminations I have personally experienced. It has made me sympathetic to those who write against a certain kind of liberals know best. Around the same time, I experienced my most direct face-to-face prejudice that I've ever experienced as an academic. It was at a political theory seminar at the LSE hosted by the International Political Science Association. A very senior British political theorist stated in the discussion, following some paper or other, in the discussion, that Muslim societies were infertile ground for democracy and could only be made democratic through one or two generations of forcefully imposed change. And then, directly addressing me, not because I was the paper giver or had even spoken, but because I was the only person in the room who was a Muslim, he said, "Tariq, we all think this, so don't comfort yourself by thinking that only I think this." I'm pleased to say that a number of people spoke up against his behavior, though some only in private to me afterwards. My experience of racism then as a teenager was as a Paki. My experience of racism in academia has been as a Muslim and when speaking up for Muslims. More positively, my biggest break, which propelled me forward into sociology and academia, was that in March 1993, I was appointed as Principal Research Officer of the 4th National Survey of Ethnic Minorities at the Policy Studies Institute in London. It's difficult to understate the risk that David Smith, who recruited me, took in appointing me. I was more an armchair commentator than a social researcher. I had no idea how a survey was conducted. After all those years of unemployment and enforced exile in policy administration, I could not believe my luck. After the contract was signed, I asked David, who could read my CV as well as anyone else, I asked David why he'd appointed me, as he knew that I'd never been anywhere near a survey. He said, the Institute was full of surveyors. What it needed was an understanding of the people to be surveyed. I had been arguing that current sociology was out of touch with the ethnic minorities, especially Asians. Now, he said, was my chance to test my insights, to put my money where my mouth was. Well, it was hard work, and it took a lot longer than it was meant to. And it was a very big team effort, as you can imagine, given that I knew nothing about surveys. But the fourth survey proved to be a great success. It showed in a systematic way that the ethnic minorities were genuinely diverse. People in academia and beyond continued to think in terms of racial dualism, of a black-white Britain, and indeed some still do today. But we were able to show that they did so without the support of data. The survey book was published in May 1997 and received many plaudits from those who worked in or used social research, and a lot from the Muslim community and Asian community activists and so on, and certainly added much to my CV, and so was not insignificant in my being appointed a professor of sociology, politics and public policy in November 1997 at this university. People sometimes ask me why, despite my work being focused on racism and exclusion, I'm generally optimistic. Well, it's not just because I've seen things at various stages of my life turn out well for me personally, but also a general ongoing improvement for ethnic minorities. That then is the 45 years of my life that I brought to the university, or at least what can be told in 45 minutes. So I think I've taken longer, actually. No, I haven't. I've taken less. Great. Okay, that's good.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Tarek. That was absolutely fascinating. And just some key points I took away, and something that really hit home was when you said there's importance in difference and commonality. I thought that was beautiful. I thought that was really well done. So yeah, absolutely brilliant. Has anyone got any questions for Tarek? We've got some time, so. Oh, Steve Eichhorn, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'll put my camera on as well, Tarek. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you as well. And yeah, I was interested in your route into academia through the policy route, and I just wondered, is that route still possible now? And is there such a strong link these days in policies, as in governmental policy, and academic endeavour into race equality? Could you comment on that?
So Steve, I think I should emphasize that I only got into academia, firstly, as I said, with a couple of lucky breaks. So it's not like, oh, it could have happened then, it can't happen now. That's not the story. Secondly, it wasn't the fact that I was in policy, it was a combination of factors. If you like, I would say a triangle of factors, of which being in the relevant kind of policy, you know, racial equality type policies, and not just policy, but public engagement. I was writing in The Guardian. I also was writing some journal articles and so on. So I was getting known. So a lot of people who I worked with who were in policy and were more senior than me were, in my view, just boring old administrators. So it wasn't just the fact that it was in policy. The other two aspects were, I had a PhD in philosophy. Now, I don't know how many philosophers you know or people with PhDs in philosophy, but when you have a PhD in philosophy, you think you can engage with any subject, because philosophy is not really a subject by itself. It's a set of problems that you think about. So when you get good at thinking, then you can think about anything else. So I had quite a lot of confidence that the sociology that I was seeing was wrong and that I could point this out to them, even though I'd done no sociology, because I had a philosophical training that I could put to use. And the third very important factor, and it really is very important, and I was trying to emphasize that throughout my talk, was my personal experience. Because my personal experience was so different to most people who were activists or in politics or in policy or in the sociology of race relations. They assumed that there was a black-white society. I knew that wasn't the case, and I could speak about that experience with the intellectual equipment that I had developed as a PhD philosopher and combine it with the critique that I developed as a practitioner. So whether it's possible today to get from policy to academia, I don't know. I expect it is quite difficult if it's just policy. You have to have some kind of, academic background, academic, platform. And as you know, nowadays you can't get a job in university without a PhD. So obviously that's important. But I certainly wouldn't say it was easier then and more difficult now, because that's not really my story.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We've got a question from Yav. Have I said that right?
That's correct. Yeah, Tariq, I was interested to hear, when your family came to London, you grew up in what you described as a very Jewish area, presumably from earlier generations of refugees. I wonder what you see as the similarity or differences of the experience of Islamophobia in relation to anti-Semitism in the UK, and how much you think you can or cannot learn from one experience to the other experience.
Yeah, thank you, Yav. Yes, you are right. It was earlier generations of refugees. So this was in Willesden, more specifically Warm Lane. So there was a very big synagogue in about 150 yards away. Our doctor, who was a very, very nice, humane person we got to know obviously over the years, lived directly opposite us. He and his wife were refugees from Central Europe, as were a number of other people who we got to know less well. On Friday evenings, if we were playing on the street, or even if we weren't, the rabbi used to come and knock on our door and ask if we could come to his house briefly to switch off the electricity at the mains, as he wasn't allowed to do it, or anyone else in the house wasn't allowed to do it. I had lots of Jewish friends at school. We used to go to cricket together, play cricket, watch cricket, and so on. So I got to know Jewish people, quite early on, where I lived and the school I went to. And so remember, I was a boy becoming a teenager. So I knew nothing about Jewish people and their history. And for a long time, I don't know till when it would flip, if it did flip, in fact, for a long time, I thought Jews were a central part of British life. I actually thought they were a British elite, because I saw lots of Jewish people on TV, as cultural critics, as satirists, as people writing plays, people critiquing society, government, and so on. Jewish people had nice houses, cars, and so on. So it was only much, much later, as I say, I can't actually remember when. It may have been, I assume it was while I was still at school, let's say mid-teenage years, though I don't know, that I learned about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and so on. And of course, I would hear anti-Semitic things, just as I'm sure Jewish friends would hear anti-Pakistani, Islamophobic things in their presence, which wouldn't directly be said to me, though sometimes, of course, they were said to me. So Yeah, so I actually begin with just as a lot of people might think, I begin with a perverse experience about you know, the black-white relationship. I begin with a perverse experience about, as far as I'm concerned, the non-marginality of Northwest London Jews. So I thought, hey, these are important people, or these are people I know, I got on very well with, and so on. Specifically on your question about thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Now, some people say, I'm not a historian myself, some people say that the kind of Islamophobia that is manifested today in Western Europe is similar to the anti-Semitism manifested in Western Europe and Central Europe in the 1920s. So it is the build-up of a momentum of racism, which obviously, as we know, in 1930s led to the Holocaust and so on. So people don't want to say it's like the 1930s, but they want to say it's like the 1920s. I suppose there are some parallels, but as I say, I'm not a historian, so I wouldn't like to say it definitely is or it definitely is not. What they say share in common, as far as I'm concerned, is that you have a community whose religious heritage and traditions are central to its sense of being a community, but who is racialized by other groups of people. So I call this a racialization of an ethno-religious community. This is the Jewish historic experience. To some extent, it's also the Muslim historic experience. For instance, you know, after the Reconquista in Iberia, but it certainly is the Muslim experience today in Western countries, in Muslim minority contexts. So that is the closest parallel. But I have to say that I think that Islamophobia exceeds anti-Semitism in its frequency, in its intensity, and in its effects. And so I can't help but get irritated when I see, for instance, this government give political prioritization to the lesser of the two racisms in terms of policy action, in terms of campaigning, and in terms of political leadership.
Thank you, Yoav. Does anyone have any other questions for Tarek? Got a few minutes left.
Yeah, I thought I was going to do 45 minutes in 45 minutes because I usually overrun, actually. And I did practice yesterday and I saw that it was less than 40. So I thought, oh, should I put a few little gems or something in? And then I just decided, no, my tendency to exceed should caution me against adding stuff.
Oh, you did well, though. You should have kept that page in. You got rid of that page.
Oh, yes, I did. Because the thing is, for those of you who don't know, so the Salman Rushdie affair, meaning the Satanic Verses, the battle over the novel Satanic Verses, and some of you, of course, are even too young to even have heard of this, or it really was a very formative experience for me in two important ways. Firstly, it made me much closer to the Muslim community than I'd been up to that point. And it made me think of myself as a Muslim much more than I'd ever done. And it made me see how hurt and angry, and obviously potentially violent, as that was manifested, Muslims could be when they felt humiliated about their religion, especially the honor of the Prophet Muhammad. And that we couldn't have a successful multicultural Britain without addressing that. And therefore, the Muslim, non-Muslim relation had to be at the center of anyone who was serious about multiculturalism in Britain. And that was something that was very, very radical. Nobody was saying that. In fact, lots of people were saying the opposite. And the second way in which that affair was very important was, I suppose, my visibility. I became quite visible because I was able to present myself pretty well in print, like, you know, The Guardian and The Independent, in journal articles, but also on, you know, TV and radio and community events and so on. And so really, even though I left that page out, it's not because it lacked significance. It's because I thought I was going to overrun in time, and because I've made the points that I've just made to you in summary several times in various locations. So it was actually, in terms of my present job and my present intellectual and research thinking, it was actually one of the most formative experiences.
Yeah, it sounds it. And you detail quite a few in your early years as well, and you talked about the cross-class experiences that you experienced as well, and how that actually helped break a mold and your path. And I just wondered, to summarize, what was really the turning point or the key pinnacle moment that you feel in your life that has enabled you this wonderful path that you're now on?
Yeah, so I think there have been several good breaks, but if I had to pick one without which I'd never have got the job that I currently have, I certainly wouldn't have got it in 1997 anyway, was, however ludicrous the appointment was, being made the principal research officer of the 4th National Survey of Ethnic Minorities. And again, most of you won't even have heard of it, and you know, why should you? But it was a very significant survey. It was the single biggest survey that used to exist at that time about ethnic minorities in Britain. It was roughly carried out once every sort of 10 years or so. It wasn't precisely so. And it was before we had an ethnic question in the census. Now, of course, we have quite a lot of data from the census. In those days, we didn't. Or we just started, maybe in 1981. It just started, 81, no, 91. Anyway, I can't remember precisely. But so it was a very important position. And to be given to someone who not only was not a social researcher in the sense of like an empirical sociologist, but didn't really know about surveys. I mean, I could read, you know, a table as long as it was just cross tabulation and didn't have any logistic regression in it. So I'd never tried to design a questionnaire. I'd never thought about sampling and weighting, none of those things. But I had an excellent team of people, some who were already present, some recruited after my arrival, and together we managed to create what I think people generally acknowledge is a rather fine product. And I would put it like this: it was a fine product because it successfully married the left half of the brain with the right half of the brain. So I was on one side because I didn't think quantitatively, I didn't know the sociology of race relations, though I had been getting into it. I certainly wasn't a surveyor, but loads of other people were, but they didn't understand issues about ethnic minorities from the inside in the way that I did. And we managed to synthesize those two understandings, those two halves of the brain.
That's a wonderful way of looking back on it and summarizing. That's brilliant. Has anyone else got any questions for Tarek in the next couple of minutes? Oh, well,
I see a message from Yoav. Yeah. So James Nazrou was a classmate, I think, schoolmate.
Yeah.
Yoav, yeah. So
yeah, he was in medical school. It was my year at medical school.
James was a very important member of that team, and as you'll be aware, has gone on to have a very distinguished career in sociology and epidemiology.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, if there's no, well, oh, Imogen Barfield, to unmute.
Sorry, yeah. Oh, am I
You're
still
on.
on mute?
Yeah.
Okay,
you're on.
sorry. I'm interested to know, Tariq, when you were describing your dad and his instructions to you for the assembly.
Yeah.
Looking back on that, what's your view on his instruction to you then, now?
That's a very good question, Imogen. So I think if I could go back one step further, supposing we had never come to Britain, because I won't go into the family story, but it was a sheer accident that we came, you know. There hadn't been a plan to come. And as you can see from my story, aspects of my family migration is very different from the labor migration of most Pakistanis and Mirpuris, Mirpuri being the region in Kashmir that most Pakistanis in Britain come from, more than half. And so I often think to myself, well, what if we'd never come to Britain? What kind of person would I be? And I know that I'd be a very different person. So to answer your question, the difference is not as radical as if I'd never come to Britain, of course. It's not as radical as that. But I do think that my dad making a decision very early on that I should fully participate in Christian instruction and Christian worship, and not just participate from the sidelines, but as I said, in the end, I was a leading member. Yeah, so what I should say, it never made me a Christian. So at no point was I thinking, oh, I was a Christian, no. So my dad was absolutely clear, we were Muslims and, you know, so it wasn't like that. Yeah, so I don't want you to give the wrong idea. I think it kind of threw some light on Islam for me, and Islam threw some light on Christianity for me. And so I liked some things more than I otherwise would about Islam, because I saw the Christian aspect to it, and I perhaps was more drawn to Christianity than I otherwise would have been, because I saw that it shared some things in common with Christianity, with Islam. Though above all, it's absolutely clear, it was clear to me then, as it's clear to me today, that the religion Islam is closest to, of course, is Judaism. Islam and Judaism are very, very close. It's a shame that politics has driven them apart. But in terms of religious traditions, they are very close. And in terms of sensibilities about community and caring and family. So I'm not sure how I would have been different, but I think it did definitely have an influence. Have an influence on me. It also, bear in mind that at this time, Muslims were only just arriving and settling in Britain, in England, and where I lived was an area that actually came to be an area of big Asian, both Muslim and Hindu settlement, i.e. Willesden or northwest London, if we extend it to Wembley, say. But at that time it wasn't. So I knew very few Muslims. And so I wasn't participating in a lot of Muslim activities, but I was participating in these Christian activities. So I didn't think I was Christian. I didn't want to be Christian, but I enjoyed participating in Christian activities. So I think it's bound to have influenced my religious sensibility in some way, even if I can't precisely put my finger on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imogen. Was there one more person who wanted to ask a question? We've run out of time, but we can.
Morteza.
Yeah.
Hello. Sorry. So I assume as the last question, I think that all of us as sociologists and also as non-white people at the university are in a better situation as a result of the works of you yourself and the intellectuals like you, and I should thank you for that.
Thank you for
But
saying that. That's very kind.
my final question is if you have any advice for the younger generation of Muslims at the university, what would that be? If you want to give us just one advice, for example.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, I was recently asked by someone very senior at the Muslim Council of Britain if I had any advice. And the advice I gave to that person is the advice I will give you for the younger generation. The Muslim Council of Britain very wisely chose a motto. So they were founded in 1997, and I was a speaker at the founding meeting. Very wisely chose the motto, the common good. And the common good is a very important part of my political thinking, as well as of my theoretical understanding of politics, well, what we might call normative political theory. And what I said to them is, what you need to do is to think about the common good for British Muslims. You know, what is it? How can it be fostered? What should be avoided? What should be encouraged? But at the same time, simultaneously, think about the common good for Britain. How can the common good for Britain be nurtured and encouraged in a way that it overlaps with or encompasses, better still, encompasses the common good for Muslims? How to bring together these two aspirations, common good for British Muslims, which I've tried to pursue in my work, and that's what motivated me at the time of the Rushdie affair and thereafter, and the common good for Britain, which I think is an equal motivation of my work, though some people see multiculturalism as divisive and so on. I've always seen the multiculturalism that I've tried to develop as, to use a phrase I used earlier and that Vicky picked out, as bringing together difference and commonality. So even though I'm always going on about identity and difference, racism, exclusion, of course, this is within a framework of aspiring to bring people together to achieve the common good. And I think the younger generation of Muslims, and even old ones like me, that should be our goal. To use an African-American phrase, that should be the prize.
Thank you, Tariq.
Well, thank you ever so much, Tariq. We've had comments galore saying thank you and such an interesting presentation. And yeah, thank you so much for doing today's Their Stories. And if anyone's got any further questions afterwards, please feel free to contact us or Tariq directly. And
yeah, feel free to contact me. And thank you so much for coming and listening to it all. Thank you for your questions and comments as well.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.